Welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Mary, and today's video is going to be my final November wrap-up. So I'm going to start off this video like I usually do with my stats. I actually did a mid-month wrap-up this month, so if you would like to see any of the first books that I read, I won't be talking about those specifically in this video, but there are 8 books that are discussed in that video. I'll have it linked in the card down below in case you want to watch that. First off, I did read 12 books in November, so not quite as many as I'd hoped, but still a really good number. I was actually surprised that it was so many, but I did have like 3 books, I think, carry over from last month, so that definitely helped with the numbers. I read a total of 3,975 pages, and that does include the pages of the book that I started at the end of this month and did not finish. For my demographics, I read 0 middle grade, 2 young adult, 1 new adult, and 9 adult books, which is pretty typical for me. I typically read a lot more adult books than I do young adult, middle grade, etc. I have my notes in front of me, so if I'm looking down, that's why. For star ratings, I gave 0 1 stars, 1 2 star, 3 3 stars, 5 4 stars, and 2 5 stars. So that's a total, or an average of 3.9 stars per book. For genre, I read 4 fantasy, 2 nonfiction, 2 general fiction, 1 contemporary, 2 horror, and 1 historical fiction. For type, I read 10 traditional novels, 1 collection of essays, and 1 collection of short stories. For the way that I read these books, I listened to 4 books via audio, I read 5 books as an ebook, and I read 3 books physically. And then I got 11 of these books from the library. 1 of them I did already own, and I did not purchase any books for this TBR. I did not start or finish any series, but I did continue in 2 series, so that's always good. I read 1 translated work this month. I read from 3 male authors and 9 female authors. 8 of the authors I read from were white this month. I read from 1 black author and 3 authors that were non-black people of color. Okay, and those are the stats that I have. I need to get better at like remembering what stats I talk about in each video, because some of these are definitely new, but others of them I might have forgotten something, I'm not sure. So I am working on getting more organized with that. But now I'm just gonna go ahead and talk about the last 4 books that I read for this month. So if you've been tracking with me, you know that I'm supposed to be doing nonfiction November. I didn't finish any more nonfiction. I'm in the middle of In Extremis by Lindsay Hilsum. That's the memoir. I have it over there. I guess I should have brought it. That's okay. I have it from my library until December 10th, so I'm still working on reading that. But I just wasn't going to finish it. I have about 300 pages left, so it just wasn't going to happen. But I am enjoying it. It's just something that I'm having to go through slower. I didn't read very much at the end of this month because I had just a lot going on. The first book that I've read since we last spoke was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, and I actually give this 5 stars. So this is a standalone YA fantasy. It's the first book that I read by Naomi Novik, and I wanted to read it before I picked up the first book in the Scholomance series that she released this year, because I don't want to start a bunch of series. I said that like a million times, but I just don't want to start series if I don't know if I'm going to love them. And so I wanted to make sure this author was somebody that I really gelled with, and I absolutely loved Spinning Silver. It's not set in Russia, but it's like a Russian-esque setting. It's very snowy, very wintry, very like Slavic sounding names for everything. And it follows this girl, Miriam, who is Jewish, living in this village, and her dad is the moneylender for the village, but he's not very good at collecting on the debts that he's owed. And so Miriam's family is starving, basically, and she decides that she's going to take it upon herself to pick up the debts from everyone around her. And so she does. She goes and collects the debts that her family is owed from all these people who've been borrowing money that they haven't been paying back. And with that, they end up hiring another girl, Wanda, who her dad owes debts, but he can't pay them. So he says, my daughter will work to pay off my debts. Meanwhile, Wanda's dad is actually really abusive, so Wanda's happy to get out of that home. And Miriam's family is actually paying her money in addition to taking money for the debts that they're owed. And she's just saving that to the side. And so it follows them, and then there's also like the daughter of a local like duke or lord, and all of these women's lives are sort of having to intertwine. And then Miriam, because she is collecting on the debts, it starts bragging that she can turn silver into gold. And there are these like elf-like fae creatures called the Starrick who hear of her bragging, and they're basically like gold-obsessed fae. And the king of the Stark comes down and starts giving her silver to turn into gold. And he gives her basically these 3 quests. And so it's really a story about like, it's like a very layered story, because all of the 3 like main points of view have their own things going on. And it's just all this like really interesting layering where these girls have to work together, but they don't really know what the other girls are fully doing, and they don't really trust each other. But it had such a like dark fairy tale element, and I think that's something that I'm discovering that I'm really, really loving, because I also really loved What Should Be Wild. I just really enjoy like the element of fairy tales in books, and I liked this book because at first I thought it was going to be like 3 different plot lines, and I was confused as to how any of them were going to intertwine, but they were able to like stack and layer on each other so beautifully. And I also loved the world building of like the Starix world versus the human world. I thought that was really interesting. I just really, really would recommend this book if you're interested in stuff like that. I know the other thing that I'm learning about myself is that I don't think I like series more than standalones. I think I prefer standalones to series. Not in every case. I do read series and enjoy them some of the time, but I just think maybe for my like attention span and just for my personal enjoyment, I would rather have the full story at once, because sometimes I feel like in series, and I think some people do enjoy this, but sometimes in series, the author will add in an extra plot or an extra conflict that then resolves itself at the end of that book, because each book sort of has to have its own conflict and resolution, whereas I would just prefer the overarching plot, I think, is like my point of view. But I know that especially a lot of fantasy readers really do prefer series, so that would be interesting. I'd be interested to know how you feel. Do you prefer series or standalone? The next book that I read since the last time we spoke was The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. This is I had this slated for historical fiction, and I kept it in that like spot, because it's technically a historical fantasy because it's about like the Greek gods, but it's not really. It's set in the Trojan War, and it's women from a city in Troy. I can't remember the name of it. I'm sorry. I don't speak Greek. I don't really know that much about Greek mythology either, but their city is sacked, and so they're taken as slaves for the Greek soldiers and fighters like Achilles, and there's other names that I can't remember. Agamemnon is the king. I don't remember all of their names. I'm really sorry. But it's primarily told from Briseis. I might be saying that wrong, but she was like Achilles' slave. And I looked up, and in real Greek mythology, she kind of was too, but they're like sort of treated as sex objects. But this book was sold to me as like a feminist, not feminist, but like a retelling of the Trojan War from the perspective of the women who lost everything, because when the cities were sacked, the men were killed, but the women were taken as slaves and had to live on. And so it's sort of about how you reconcile having to go to bed with the man who killed your son and your husband and your father, like how you sort of deal with that, and the trauma that war leaves behind on the women who lose everything in it. I read more just about being about war and about the trauma the war inflicts on women than it did as like a fantasy. Like Achilles was a character and it was about this Greek myth, but it very much read more like a story about war than it did about a story about Achilles. I will say though, I gave this book 4 stars, and it would have been a 5-star read for me because I thought the writing style was really eloquent and beautiful. I thought the stories that it told were really important. But the author wrote some of it from the perspective of Achilles, and I feel like that really did a disservice to the fact that this was supposed to be a book about the women of war. I didn't care, personally. Like, if I'd wanted to read a book about Achilles' like personal struggles with how he felt about having to go to war, then I would have picked up a book that was supposed to be about that. For me, this didn't feel like it was supposed to be about that, and so that felt really out of place, and it just kind of put me off the whole book, because it felt like the author was trying to make Achilles into this sympathetic subject, whereas the book is literally about him taking captive women and young girls and like forcing himself on them. So I just didn't find him sympathetic. I just felt like it was very clashy to me, and it didn't really work. However, overall, I did still think it was a really good book, and I really appreciated the perspective and like the view that it gave you, because I feel like we don't often get that sort of perspective during war. And then I finished The Girl in the Tower by Katherine Arden, which is the second book in the Winter Night trilogy. I'm not going to talk too much about this one as it is a sequel. I read this for the prompt of a series, and I did end up giving it 4 stars, which I gave the first book in the series 3 stars. So I did like this book better than I liked the first book in the series. It follows a young girl in medieval Russia, and she is what you call sighted, which means that she can see the old gods like the domovoys and the god of the stable and all these little, not god, like spirits, and like the Winter King and all these different like demons and spirits that live among them and help protect the communities in medieval Russia. But because of the introduction of Christianity, the people in these communities are no longer paying any attention to the old gods and the old demons the way that they used to by giving them sacrifices, like putting bread in their oven for the domovoi and just different things like that. And because of this, like, introduction of Christianity, the domovoi and all of the, like, spirits that are supposed to protect the villages are getting really weak. And so they're allowing, like, the evil presence of, like, evil spirits into the villages. And that's just, it's sort of about that problem and how Vasya, since she's sighted, people think she's a witch. And in the first book, Vasya gets a stepmother who is also sighted, but she thinks that they're demons because she's a very devout Christian. And so she sort of, like, alerts the local priest that Vasya can see these things. And it's just about, like, that kind of conflict. About, like, old gods versus new gods and old religion versus new religion. It's very interesting. I like that element of it a lot. It's also very wintry, which is nice. What I preferred in the second book to the first book is a lot of setting up what's happening. And the second book, I feel like, does a better job of explaining what... I think that's the first time calling it sighted is even mentioned. I just know from other people's reviews that that's what it's called. And it, like, explains more why Vasya can see the things that she can see and who can see them and who can't. And it also gives you a little bit more of, like, family history of Vasya. And you get to interact more with her siblings because the second book, she goes to Moscow, so she's not in her little village anymore. So she's back with her older siblings. I just feel like it did a better, like, not better. I liked it better because I liked the fact that Vasya was sort of allowed to become more of herself. I will say... one thing that I've discovered that I really don't like is a plot that is fully driven by, or like a conflict that only exists because of miscommunication. That's something that really frustrates me, and it can feel to me very unrealistic because it just sort of seems like that wouldn't happen. I don't know. Or like that's a dramatized version of what would happen because I just find it hard to believe that there's anybody who, if they weren't listening to you, you wouldn't, like, make yourself heard, if that makes sense. Which maybe is just, like, me being super outspoken. Like, I don't understand that and can't relate to it. But that's something that I've decided that in books I just don't enjoy. And this was a really low 4-star for me. It was only almost a high 3-star. And it's because so much of the conflict in The Girl in the Tower is just based on miscommunication. And, like, someone not listening to someone else. And that person just being like, oh, well, they won't listen to me. And, like, that's it. And I don't like that. But I do think it's a really good book, and I like where it's going. I don't know. And then the last book that I finished in the month of November is Frankenstein in Baghdad. And I gave this 2 stars. I'm really sad. I did not like this book very much at all. It was sold to me as, like, a horror book that was a retelling of Frankenstein, and I don't think that's really what it was. I think it had elements of Frankenstein. This takes place in war-torn Iraq after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think is when it starts. And it basically follows a bunch of different perspectives of different people who live in Iraq in Baghdad at this time. And one of them is Hadi, the, like, trash collector, or, like, the junk. He, like, basically has a junkyard, and he finds body parts and sews them together to make this creature that he calls What's-His-Name. And somehow What's-His-Name gets a spirit of somebody who dies in him, and then he now has to kill everyone who has anything to do with any of his body parts, or he has to kill the people who killed them. It's like a revenge sort of spiral, and I feel like this would have been better described as, like, a commentary on war, and what war can do to people, what war does to, like, harm people, because there's all sorts of, like, stories in here of people who have suffered because of this conflict that's happening. And so I feel like this is better described as, like, a general fiction with some horror elements just about war, than it is to be described as a horror. And I think because I was going into it expecting this to be a horror book, I just didn't really click with it very much. I also feel like I lack a lot of the cultural context and the historical context of this, just because, like, first of all, I wasn't expecting to have to use this much brain power to read this book because I was expecting just sort of like a horror book. And also I just felt like a lot of it didn't really click for me. It didn't work for me, and it wasn't anything that I was familiar enough with to properly appreciate. Also, I felt like the writing style was kind of confusing, and I think that comes down to the translation. I think that some of the prose was really choppy, some of it didn't, like, not make sense, but I think perhaps some of the, like, idioms or whatever weren't properly translated to be in a way that would make sense in English. I feel like that's the risk you sort of run when you read a translated work, is that you're not reading work from an author, you're reading work from a translator. And so it doesn't always connect the same way. And that's sort of how I felt about that one. But yeah, those are the last 4 books that I read this month. Like I said, if you want to hear my thoughts about the first 8 books that I read, I'll have that video linked somewhere so you can watch that. I would love to know how your reading month went and what your favorite book that you read this month was. If you've read any of the books that I talked about in this video, please let me know how you felt about them. But that's gonna be it for me today, and I will see you in my next video.